Good evening. I am David Rowe, the director of the Center for the Study of American Democracy here at Kenyon. This fall, the center, in conjunction with the Office of Alumni and Parent Engagement, is sponsoring a series of 6 online panels that examine the continued viability of the American experiment by drawing on the deep reservoir of Kenyon alumni, parents, faculty, and friends actively engaged in America's democratic life. I am pleased to welcome you tonight to the third panel in our series, Law, Order, Justice, and Democracy. Before we get started, please let me thank the many people who made this evening possible. These include Lindsay Colopy, Adam Gilson, Annie Gordon, Kent Woodward Ginther from the Offices of Alumni and Parent Engagement, Communications, and Advancement. I also thank Andrea Leckleitner and Nancy Powers from the Center for the Study of American Democracy, along with the Center's student associates, Rose Fisher, class of 22, and Max Onazorg, class of 21. Brittany Balow of Kenyon's Library and Information Services provided technical support. Finally, I thank the many alumni, faculty, parents, and friends of the college whom we consulted as we put the program together. The rule of law is the most critical element of liberal democratic government. It is what secures our fundamental rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, to paraphrase the Declaration, and does so by protecting us in 2 distinct but complementary ways. The rule of law protects us from one another's bad behavior, seen most clearly in laws against crimes such as theft, assault, or murder, but also through the myriad health, safety, environmental, and commercial laws and regulations that structure the everyday fabric of everyday life. Equally important, the rule of law also protects us from harmful acts by the state and its agents, and especially their use of the law's awesome powers of enforcement by constraining them only to act solely within the law for solely public purposes and subject to public review. By protecting us from the harmful acts of others, whether private persons or officers of the state, the rule of law provides the foundations for social trust, builds prosperity by enabling us to undertake positive sum interactions with others, and secures human liberty essential to leading lives of consequence and purpose. The rule of law has become a central issue in our time. In terms of people's everyday interactions with the law, this summer's widespread protests and demands for police reform in the wake of the George Floyd killing and other instances of aggressive policing spring from a longstanding systemic bias in policing that disproportionately affects America's Black communities and communities of color. But we've also seen broad concerns emerge about whether the law enforcement and adjudication functions of the executive and judiciary have become overly politicized, a prize to be won in partisan competition rather than elements of a system designed to channel and contain our political conflicts with one another inside of the robust constraints of the Constitution. Finally, conflicts between the Congress and the president, including but not limited to this year's earlier impeachment proceedings, raise concerns that the checks and balances embedded within the Constitution and their role in constraining executive power may be too weak given the partisanship of our current political climate. To help us think through these and other important issues raised by the rule of law and how it is faring in American democracy, I am pleased to welcome our panelists this evening. I'm going to go in alphabetical order. Our first panelist is Sean Franzblau, class of 05, an assistant U.S. attorney working in the Public Corruption and Organized Crime section of the U.S. Attorney's Office in Chicago. Brian Mason, class of 98, is now Chief Trial Deputy in the District Attorney's Office in Colorado's 17th Judicial District and is currently running to become the District Attorney of that district. Judge Kathleen O'Malley, class of 1979, sits on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit. She was appointed to this position by President Obama in 2010 after serving for 16 years as a judge on the District Court for the Northern District of Ohio. Matthew Sanders, class of 08, is a supervising attorney at the Juvenile Unit of the King County Department of Public Defense. Please note this evening that the panelists occupy positions of public authority, but are speaking solely in their personal capacities and may be able to and may be unable to answer some questions or address some topics. The panel will converse for about 40 minutes and then take questions from the audience for another 40 to 45 minutes. You may post questions in the chat accompanying the YouTube live stream. We ask too that participants in the chat please identify themselves by their real names as a way of helping to maintain a constructive civic dialogue. We will try to answer as many questions as we can, but may not take them in order to maintain a flow of conversation. Please note finally that our intention this evening is not a partisan debate or the scoring of partisan points, but rather we strive for a constructive, probing, and civic discussion that takes others seriously and seeks to generate greater understanding about the consequential forces at play in American democracy at this time. Our hope is that we all will come away this evening knowing more about the topic than when we started. With that, please join me in welcoming Sean, Brian, Judge O'Malley, and Matt to our conversation tonight. Thank you. Where I would like to begin this evening is just simply by defining for the audience what the rule of law is. The rule of law is a term that we often hear bandied about, and people often speak about it, but often when you, and especially, I've discovered in class with students, when you drill down and say, I need some clarity here, that they often, like the sound of the term, but don't really have a way of explaining what it is and what its implications are. And so where I would like to start is just with a discussion about what the rule of law is and why we think the rule of law is so important to a liberal democratic society. And so, Judge O'Malley, I would just like, if I may, to start with you. How do you see the rule of law? What do you see the rule of law as? How do you see it working? Why do you think it is so important?
Well, a pithy response on what the rule of law is would be from Thomas Paine, where he said it just means that in America, law is king. But a less pithy response from that would be that we as a society, when we adopted the Constitution, entered into a social contract that we would be governed by laws and not by men. So not by the whims of the majority or the tyranny of the sovereign. And that means that everybody, all institutions, all individuals, even the government would all be subject to a series of laws that are publicly passed, understandable, that are enforced fairly and equitably, and that are consistent with the principles that are laid out in the Constitution. But all of those things are important. To me, one of the most important parts is the fact that it is a social contract. And there's a very delicate balance if we lose willingness to continue to be part of that contract. I can get up every morning and know that if I go out and want to cross the street at a crosswalk, that the people driving are going to stop at the light because that's what the law says they should do. That's a very simple example, but there are many others that are much broader, and you can understand that if we can't rely on others to follow the law, then our social contract falls apart.
Okay, and so in a way, right, that they have to see the law or the rule of law is in some sense legitimate to entail their cooperation with the law. Is that
exactly? And what that means is, because I believe that some of the most important aspects of the rule of law are separation of powers, the fact that we have judicial review, the public has to be able to have confidence in the courts, in law enforcement, and they have to have confidence in our public institutions. And if we erode that confidence or don't earn that confidence, then the entire social contract is at risk.
Okay, good. Matt, would you like to come in, add, or to what Judge O'Malley has said, provide?
Sure. Yeah, no, I'd love to. I tend to agree with what the judge says, and I think one of the things that we're confronting now is, in a perfect world, the laws are intended to be created by consensus of the majority, as we know, and enforced equitably or not in a non-discriminatory manner. And in order for these laws to have their intended effect, there needs to be the appearance of legitimacy or confidence in that system. And I think the judge pointed out, confidence in law enforcement, confidence in public institutions. And what can happen is these laws that are supposed to be created by way of consensus, there's going to be disagreement about these, and there's going to be disagreement about a lot of these laws that are created. And one of the questions that can arise, in particular, it's arising now when you see voter laws and other laws that aren't necessarily laws that the majority of Americans would agree with, is it undermines this system, and people start to lose respect for the system when they see law enforcement behaving in ways that perhaps would be inconsistent with our expectation of what law enforcement should do in our communities. When you see a law that should be equitably applied to everybody, but then you see over policing in a certain area, so it's not being equitably distributed across the entire community. And so one of the things I hope we talk about today, I guess to answer your question, is that I believe in theory, law should be what protects us from the vices of men. And I say men because typically it's the vices of men that we're concerned about, and that they apply equally and equitable, and they result in equitable outcomes, and they're fair. And the problem is, frequently with the laws that we see, there's disagreement about the equitable distribution, the fairness, and the underlying cause or force driving these laws.
Okay. And one of the things that you bring up that I think is really interesting, and it actually goes back to Judge O'Malley's sort of point about being able to cross the street, is that we often talk about these things as if they're abstract concepts, right? Oh, well, you got the rule of law, and but where it really matters is in people's lived experiences, right? That it's as we come into contact with the law that we begin to form opinions about it, and we see it structuring our lives. And if those don't, and if those experiences, in a sense, don't line up with sort of these concepts of what we think the law ought to be, that's where a lot of that's where we start to have real problems. Is that?
I think that's a fair statement, and I want to leave time for Brian and Sean to opine on this. I would just leave it with, we're seeing more and more now that people are living in their own little worlds, and the world that you see is what you believe it to be. And so if you've had nothing but positive experiences with, say, police, then that is going to be that's going to be the way you perceive the world and the way you operate in it. And it's going to become anathema or hard to understand how another person could see police and feel fear or feel scared or feel like they're actually not there to protect them. And it's trying to build that bridge so people can actually start to have conversations that I think panels like this are intended to do.
All right. Well, with that, let's kick over Brian. Sean, I'll go to Brian first.
Thank you. First of all, thank you so much for having us tonight. It's just great to see the purple behind you, David Rowe, and the Kenyon College logo. This is the coolest panel I've been on, and I'm on a lot of them right now. I guess I don't have much to add to either what the judge or what Matthew said. I think that the rule of law is a social contract, and it's a social contract that we essentially agree that we will be governed by laws and not by the whims of a monarch or the whims of a ruler, and that those laws will be fairly and justly applied. The one thing I'll add is a concept that I learned from the late, great Harry Clore as a student at Kenyon College. And that was the concept of the regime, that the rule of law works based on the regime that undergirds it. So rule of law is only successful if the regime in which we are governed and in which we live has institutions that have the respect of those people that it does govern and is followed by the people. And I think that concept was something that I took for granted before I learned about it as a student at Kenyon, and learned about other systems of government in other countries and how they're governed, and one that I think many Americans have taken for granted for a long, long time, but is up for discussion in our current political turmoil.
Okay, Sean?
Yeah, so I agree with everything that's been said. You know, in preparing for this panel, I was flipping through some of my old Kenyon College texts, and I came across one of my favorite passages from Federalist 51. James Madison says that, and this was about the separation of powers, but it applies very much to the rule of law, that in framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this: you must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself. So I think one way to think about the rule of law is that latter clause, is that the rule of law are the formal rules, but very importantly, to Brian's point, the norms in place that oblige the government to control itself. It is not enough that you have laws on the books and that you pay lip service to those laws, or you have judicial bodies that interpret those laws. You have to have norms and practices in place where the executive listens to what the judges say and abides by what they say. And if you think about that, that's really normative because there's nothing explicit in the Constitution that says the executive has to yield to the judiciary. And if you think about it, the judiciary is sort of, the executive has the sword, Congress has the purse, the judiciary doesn't have any mechanism of power. They have the public faith and the legitimacy. And part of their legitimacy is that they are acting outside and in a way above these political realms that the other two branches operate in. And so we will submit to them because they're sort of separated and in a way above it. But when that sort of starts to be, that seal or barrier starts to be breached and you get those political influences coming into the judiciary, now we have a problem because people may no longer be willing to yield to the non-democratic, non-representative branches.
Okay. So in your guys' experiences, I mean, you know, you've both identified in some way ways in which the law works, or the rule of law works, but also places at points that the rule of law can begin to not work, or we can begin to lose, you know, the sense of legitimacy or rightness in how we see the law being applied or adjudicated. Now, you know, have you had, and you don't have to answer this if you don't want, you know, do you have concerns, you know, over, say, the last, we'll say 15 years about how the rule of law has developed? Or what areas do you think we now face challenges as we think about how is it that we create a structure that is broadly seen as fair and legitimate, that enables us, you know, to live good lives with one another? I mean, are there concerns that you guys have? Judge O'Malley.
Yeah, yes, and this goes to Sean's last point. I have very serious concerns about what I believe is an attack on the independence of the judiciary. I believe that whenever I talk about the importance of the independence of the judiciary, I always begin with saying that judiciary has an obligation to earn respect of the public. So I start there. And I think that to the extent that anybody that enters the judiciary chooses not to be a neutral arbiter and chooses to be a political arbiter, that they hurt their own institution. But I think more than that, what I perceive is that the current attacks on the judiciary, and this is not one political party over the other. I mean, Chuck Schumer went on CNN and talked about 3 branches of government, and he said they were the executive, the House, and the Senate. We didn't even get a footnote. And that is true with respect to both political parties. They just attack the courts. They think if the courts don't decide things the way they like them, that makes the courts illegitimate. And the judges are now being threatened. Their lives are being threatened because people claim that they're not legitimate. And I think that the danger is that when you politicize the courts, the public starts to lose respect in the courts, and that they won't honor the decisions or the rule of law. And that, to me, is a grave risk to our entire social contract, not just to the independence of the judiciary, because I think that is the key aspect. that you have to honor judicial review. You have to honor that whether judges make mistakes or not, they are the judges. They are the ones who enforce the law, or who ultimately decide the law. And so I think that to the extent that we delegitimize the courts, we are really, really creating our own dangers as it relates to the rule of law.
Okay, Matt, and then Brian.
And I'm glad you mentioned that, Judge, because I'm curious as a judge how you grapple with that, because frequently, you know, even in Washington State, judges are elected, but frankly, it's nonpartisan and they don't engage in politics. They're supposed to be above that, right? And so there could be a tax levied or judgments made in the media and you don't respond. And yet this institution is being politicized right now. I mean, we know that. We know what's going on with the Supreme Court nomination and the fact that they didn't give Merrick Garland an opportunity to have a hearing, and yet they gave, Connie Barrett an option. Trump will attack judges explicitly, and there's a question now whether or not there's going to be a peaceful transfer of power, right? Like these things that we've valued, and yet judges have been largely quiet on these points, right? And so I guess, what do judges do to have their position known? Like a Justice Roberts, I guess he speaks to his opinions, and you can infer from his opinions what he's attempting to do with the court. But besides that, when politicians are politicizing this important institution, how are courts to respond to that?
Well, that there is that danger, because obviously we are limited, our voices are limited. But having said that, I think that there is a greater realization in recent years that we do have the moral suasion, the ability to engage in moral suasion. We can, in instances like this, or in educational instances, take the opportunity to defend the system as a whole. I mean, I can't defend a decision that I make. I can't, answer the press if they say, how do you feel about getting overturned by the Supreme Court? Or why did you make that decision? But I can defend the institution. And I think that judges are doing that more, and working with bar associations, working with organizations throughout the country to help send the message that this is important, not just for the judges. It's not a perk for the judges. It is something that actually protects the public. And it's a message that has to get out, I think.
Okay, Brian.
So President Andrew Jackson once said of Chief Justice Marshall, Chief Justice Marshall has made his decision, now let's see him enforce it. Mm-hmm. And that was probably one of the most direct attacks on the judiciary in American history. But really, the great American experiment, one of our success stories, has been the independence of the judiciary, and has been the fact that all of our other institutions, the executive and the legislative branch, have submitted themselves to judicial authority and have abided by those decisions. And I guess one prime example in my life was shortly after couple years after I graduated from Kenyon. I had the great opportunity to work in the Clinton White House, and was there during the last 2.5 years, and intended to stay on in an Al Gore administration. And of course, we all remember what happened in the election of 2000, and it was adjudicated by the US Supreme Court, and Al Gore conceded. And there is a whole lot of us to this day who still feel like that election wasn't fair, but that nevertheless the rule of law was respected. And that principle has indeed been one of the reasons why the great American experiment has succeeded. And it's one of the reasons why I'm so deeply concerned about where we are now. And I agree with the judge. This is not just a one-party thing. And I'm a Democrat. I'm running for office as a Democrat right now, and proudly so. But both parties are at fault in this. Barack Obama, who I revere, criticized the Supreme Court in a State of the Union address with the Supreme Court justices sitting right in front of him. So neither side is perfect on this issue, but I do think that we're in a whole different territory under Donald Trump's presidency. The attack on the legitimacy of the judiciary when and only when he disagrees with a decision that the judiciary makes. This truly undermining of the rule of law. And as Matthew already talked about, calling into question the legitimacy of an election in advance when he's the chief law enforcement officer of the land. That undermines the regime, which I've already talked about. That undermines public confidence. And if we can't have a safe transfer of power in our country, that of course would be a huge wound to the American experiment, something like we have never ever experienced. I mean, we held an election during the Civil War and kept going. So those are some pretty scary issues, I think, that we face right now. And I'm glad we're talking about it.
I'd like just to drill down just a little bit, because, and Brian, I'll start back with you, because one of the things you said really sort of got me thinking about this. You said both parties are at fault, right? So this isn't, the erosion that we've seen, especially the growing politicization of the judiciary, isn't something that can be easily given to either political party saying you are at fault. So if both parties are doing it, right, what's driving it? Right? Why is it that we're taking something I think that everybody on this panel and probably everybody in the audience sees as one of the key institutions of American democracy, one of our great, as you put it, Brian, one of our great accomplishments as a country? Why is it that we seem to be locked in a situation where we're not just letting it decay, but in some ways through our politics actively undermining it? So just give me so what do you see driving here? I mean, what's causing this?
Yeah, and I guess I want to be clear on one thing. I think both parties have contributed to it. Mm-hmm. But I certainly do not believe today that both parties are equally at fault in the attack. Okay. And I mean that from 2016 on. Before 2016, I think both parties had criticized the court or to some extent become more political and more partisan in our debates. But I don't feel that way now. I do believe strongly, and I realize we don't want to turn this into a partisan discussion, but I do believe strongly that Donald Trump has erased norms that used to be accepted by both parties. And why is that happening? We're going to need longer than this panel to figure that out. But certainly there's an intense partisan divide in this country, and the line of that partisan divide brings up a whole lot of really tough issues: class, race, understanding of what the rule of law is, and commitment to what the rule of law is. So there are really big fissures in our democracy right now that I worry about how we're going to bring them back together.
Okay. Sean, would you like to come in?
Yeah. So, I think the nature of our Constitution is, well, first of all, it's the oldest surviving Constitution. It's roughly 233 years old. And the reason for that is because it's really short and it's really vague. And so it leaves open enough space for us to live within its broad confines, even though we live in a world that the founders absolutely would not recognize. But what this also means is that because of the nature of our Constitution, there are these big gaping holes in how it applies day to day. It's a very broad blueprint of government and society. It's not a detailed roadmap. And so there's already this huge space for interpretation, and how are we going to apply these principles day to day, particularly to new technologies and things that the founders couldn't have possibly imagined. And so the question is, who's going to fill that role of the interpretation? we have ceded in this country an enormous amount of that to judges. And I don't want to put a normative judgment on that, but I think that it doesn't have to be that way. Congress could be doing more if Congress was functioning properly. The citizenry could be doing more if they were more engaged. But for certain reasons, those things aren't happening right now. So not only just given the nature of the Constitution is there this enormous interpretive role, but we have largely ceded it entirely to the judiciary. And the other branches of government are not really functioning properly right now. And so the courts have become this battleground over the most important political issues that arguably, certainly they should be playing some part in, but arguably Congress and other branches should be playing more of a part in to achieve that constitutional balance. But because of that, the stakes are really, really high.
Okay, so one of the things you're saying is look, the reason why we're seeing so much pressure here on this part, on the rule of law itself is precisely because we're trying to essentially create outcomes that normally under sort of what we'll call normal political circumstances would be generated through the legislature, where there's back and forth, there's debate, people take positions, they explore, what the public wants, they pass law. And then over time, that law may become adjudicated, but because that process isn't happening in terms of the legislative creation of law, everything just gets pushed on to the judiciary. Is that?
I think, yeah, that is right. And I don't want to overstate it. But I do think more and more as, the citizenry have sort of become more disengaged, that we sort of just defer to judges to decide things. There are, and I believe that the vast majority of judges are not outcome driven, that they are doing their best to call balls and strikes, as Chief Judge Roberts said in his confirmation hearings. But it does create this tension in a democracy that we are ceding so much authority to unelected officials. And I do also think that part of it is that judges have become a little bit bolder in judicial interpretations. And so, to give you an example, and I respectfully differ with Brian, because I think it's appropriate for the other branches of government to criticize the court in a constructive way. As long as you're not delegitimizing them or threatening them or calling them names, I think it's appropriate. I think that's part of a healthy constitutional dialogue for the other branches to weigh in. But, Citizens United, you got to think about that opinion. The McCain-Feingold Act, and cut me off if I'll be brief, but the court basically said the First Amendment says that spending equals speech. And therefore, we're not going to allow any kinds of restrictions on it unless it's a direct contribution to a candidate and there's an appearance of corruption. But otherwise, spending is speech. Well, the First Amendment doesn't say that. And there's a lot of reasons that spending is not like speech. And there are some reasons why it may be like speech. But who's in the best position to decide that? Congress or the courts? The Congress, I think, took a reasonable interpretation of the Constitution, an interpretation that the First Amendment could easily bear without stretching or bending the text in any way, shape, or form. And the court stepped in and said, no, this is what the First Amendment means. So I would like to see from the judiciary a little bit more deference in certain circumstances to the elected branches.
Okay. Matt and then Judge O'Malley.
And I'll try to keep this as brief as I can. Interesting perspective, Sean, and I tend to agree that the Citizens United case was wrongfully decided. I think that was the case that Obama actually criticized the justices at his State of the Union address. But I keep coming back to this idea of constitutional democracy, right? And that we do have a system that allows for legislature, allows for the legislature to pass laws. But of course, and I guess I'm coming from my own position, but there needs to be a limit on their power to actually enact laws, right? So you've come up with one example of a case that was probably wrongly decided, but we could think about Plessy v. Ferguson, Dred Scott, all of these cases that are essentially laws that are, in those cases they were being, obviously I disagree with the courts there, but then you go to the civil rights era, right? And it's just a reinterpretation of these laws that could have arguably stood for the proposition that was being argued on the other side, right? And so on some level, I feel like you need that backstop. Now, should there be advocacy from the bench? I'm not sure, but I guess the thing that prevents us from having tyranny of the majority, I know you mentioned the Federalist Papers, is this idea that no matter what law you try to enact, there is going to be this constitution that's going to perhaps be a backstop or a limit to that expression. And so that's the only thing I wanted to point out. I know the judge had some input she wanted to add.
Now, there's a lot that's been said, so I can't answer all of it. I do think that there are some very specific things in the Constitution, though. I mean, I agree there's room for interpretation, but for, Article 4 of the Constitution actually says that laws have to be enforced fairly and impartially. I mean, it's right there in the Constitution. There's also we had to get some amendments, but we definitely have the fact that all men, including women, are created equal. Women to some lesser extent, still apparently, since we don't have that Equal Rights Amendment. But the importance is that there are some vagaries in the Constitution, but there are many things that are not vague, and that neither the executive nor the legislative branch should be able to act in contravention of the things that are not vague. Where there is room for interpretation, though, I think that part of the problem is that we're not going to all agree on what the best interpretation is. And I truly believe that most judges do and try to call, I don't know if I'd say it's balls and strikes, but they certainly apply the law, even if they don't like the result. I think the Supreme Court is more free to do some policy-based analysis, partially because there's no other court above them, and perhaps they do. But the rest of the judiciary does not, as far as I can see, and I've been around it for 26 years now. I mean, been on it for 26 years. I don't think Brian was saying that you shouldn't be allowed to criticize the courts. Certainly you can criticize the courts. And in fact, a public official has an obligation to criticize the courts if it has to do with the substance of their decision. It's the way in which you criticize, the disrespect that was shown by the criticism at the State of the Union. And I do agree with Brian too, that things have spiraled out of control. I gave a speech in 2016 that aside, I was very concerned about the fact that both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump had held up litmus tests as part of their campaign for judicial officers that they were going to appoint. And now it's gotten so far as that Donald Trump basically puts the list out there as if they're running mates. And at the same time, he is delegitimizing the courts by actual horrible attacks, personal attacks on judges that are so horrific that these judges have had to have extra marshal's protection. They've had death threats that they've had to be protected against, all because we had people in the government who were willing to attack them personally for their decisions. Not say I disagree with their decision, but say they're a bad person because of this decision. And that's where I think we have devolved into something that is far more dangerous.
And if I can interject here, and I think one of the things that's really dangerous about, say, and this gets back to Brian's point earlier about, sort of the announcement that we need 9 judges on the Supreme Court in case there are electoral controversies. That taints whatever, if, the election ends up there for a large part of the American populace, that taints whatever conclusion the court comes up with, because it is then, seen as being, sort of predetermined. And so, it corrodes the idea that you should have the judiciary as, in some sense, an independent check on the other 2 branches of government, but rather it is just simply yet another political branch that is a prize to be seized in partisan competition. And I think that is really, really corrosive. I'd like to switch gears a little bit, if that's okay with people. I mean, because clearly this is one place where we have a lot of concerns. Another place where we might have concerns is in how we see what we can call sort of the bias in policing. And I would just like, and so one of the things that's really interesting about this panel, right, is we've got, sort of defense, the prosecution, and the judiciary all represented. And so I'd like to say, how do you guys see this, the bias in policing? Do you see it reflected in what you see? Are there, what do you think or we should do about it? What's your experience with it? And so, and Brian, I'll start with you.
I was hoping you wouldn't start with me.
Well, okay. Matt, do you want to take Brian off the hot seat?
No. I mean, it's obviously one of the most important topics, and two, the whole world would turn upside down after the murder of George Floyd, and my entire candidacy and campaign changed overnight in terms of the questions that I got asked about and what I needed to emphasize as a candidate for public office. And just so your viewers have a little bit of context about my specific race, which we don't want to talk about, I'm running for district attorney in the judicial district in Colorado where Elijah McClain died. So my district and my race has gotten international attention. And as a first-time candidate for political office, that's been overwhelming, for sure. But it's also, I also try to see it as an opportunity, and an opportunity to do right by my community and do right by my state and by my country. I'll stop filibustering your question. Is there bias in policing? I think the statistics show clearly that there is. And that's one of the things that we have to really address as a nation and figure out what's underpinning that and what we can do about it. I mean, you only need to look at statistics about the over-incarceration of Black and brown men and women in our system to see that we have a huge race issue that has been part of our national discussion and part of the fabric of this country since the Constitution. I mean, we've talked about the Constitution. Let's just call a spade a spade. Racism was written into the Constitution at the very beginning because of slavery. And certainly that discussion has been a part of our history. I wrote my honors thesis at Kenyon College. I'm going to name drop another great professor, my mentor, John Elliott, on leadership and the civil rights movement. And I focused on 3 leaders, but one in particular was Thurgood Marshall. And he was actually the first person I studied that introduced me to the impact that a lawyer can have to make their community a better place. He's one of the reasons why I am a lawyer today. But the racial reckoning we are going through right now is really about the criminal justice system and policing and the over-incarceration of African American and Hispanics in our prison system, the school to prison pipeline. All of those things are just objectively a huge problem. And so I think your answer was, does it exist? And my answer to that question is yes, clearly it does.
Okay. Matt, would you like to come in? I mean, Brian is on the prosecuting side. You defend people. I mean, how do you see, sort of the bias that we have in policing? What ways does that affect, the people who, interact with the, come into contact with the criminal justice system?
And so it's interesting because although Brian and I guess, on some level approach these issues from different sides from a litigation standpoint as the prosecution and defense, we all agree that there's clearly an issue as it relates to to bias in policing. I think that's just a premise at this point that most people agree with on some level. But obviously some people are going to disagree, but I would just speak from my own experience in Seattle. So the Department of Justice investigated the Seattle Police Department and then the SPD fell under a memorandum of understanding for a number of years. They're still trying to get from underneath it, but the DOJ just found that there is racist policing practices in Seattle, Washington, right? This is a place that has, gay marriage. It's a very progressive area. It's a very open area, and yet the police were engaging in obviously racist police practices. I think the more interesting question really is sort of, what do you do about it? Acknowledging it and acknowledging that some people won't acknowledge it and having to meet them where they are. What do you do? And is the answer defunding the police? I'm not sure that is the right answer. I'm not sure if, we had a police chief, Carmen Best, who was a person who we appointed after the memorandum of understanding came in, the MOU. And at the end of the day, like, we're trying to find solutions, and I feel like we're missing each other in the conversation. Is if you defund the police, then all that's going to happen is that the people who are the new cadets, the most likely to be innovative, the most eager to actually change the culture, are going to be the ones that go. And the ones that are senior are going to be the ones that are protected by the union, right? And I wish that we could be more, well-rounded, or just broaden our thinking as it relates to how we deal with the police, because defunding the police is not the answer. Maybe having police not have to respond to 911 calls when there's mental health issues, or having police respond to things that frankly they're not equipped to handle. Police handle all of these issues. Whenever there's a crisis, we call 911, and we assume that these officers are like the officers we see in movies, and a lot of them just went to an academy for 8 weeks. A lot of them are just local county cops who didn't go to college and just want to serve their community, but they don't have a lot of the training that's necessary. And so should they be in that position? Should we have more social workers? Should we have more mental health crisis personnel, and allocate the resources? Does that make more sense than completely defunding the police? I don't know, maybe. But these are the questions I wish we would start having seriously on the national level.
Okay, Sean, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, no one can look at the statistics in this country with regard to the outcome of criminal defendants and not conclude that there is systemic racism in our justice system. You're sticking your head in the sand, as troubling as that is. And so there's all kinds of things we need to do to aggressively root that out. I think implicit bias training with prosecutors and police. I think we're seeing some early positive results with body-worn cameras in Chicago. But one concern I have is that, racism is a problem in all parts of life in America. It's not limited to the criminal justice system. And the criminal justice system can't alone solve the terrible and ongoing racial strife in this country. And it seems like, for whatever reason, these issues are often teed up in the criminal justice systems, because that's where these issues often come to a head in a really concrete way. And we continually get these results that are not satisfying to us. Breonna Taylor being the most recent one. And I didn't see the evidence in the Breonna Taylor case. And from my experience as a prosecutor, I generally have faith in the grand jury process and believe that people go in trying to do the right thing. So I can't comment on that specifically, but what I would say is, what the grand jury in that case was deciding was whether the officers had a certain mental state at the time they pulled the trigger. And whatever the answer to that question is, it doesn't change the fact that, or it doesn't mean we don't still have to address the question of, well, why did they go there and execute the warrant in that way? Were they behaving in ways that they wouldn't have if they were going into a white neighborhood? So it's critical that we address this in the criminal justice system. But, as Matthew was saying, it's a much bigger systemic problem, and we need a much bigger systemic solution, because if we keep trying to solve it through the criminal justice system, we're going to be continually disappointed. It's a part of the solution, and we need to do better, but we need to do better across the board.
Okay. Judge O'Malley, is there anything that you would care to add? You're muted.
Sorry about that. the one sad reality of my taking the bench when I did is that I took the bench at a time when the sentencing guidelines were mandatory. And it was awful. There was the 100-to-1 crack cocaine to powder cocaine disparity. There were huge sentences that had to be imposed. There was the 3 strikes and you're out. And also at a time before the Supreme Court had decided Batson. And while Batson has virtually no real teeth to it, at least it gave prosecutors some pause before they knocked every minority off of the jury. So when I first came on, and I've told everybody that the one reason I was not terribly sad to leave the district bench, even though I have 1,000 reasons why I was, because I loved the district bench, is that I had put so many primarily young Black men in jail for sentences that I truly believed were way too long. And I didn't have the flexibility to do otherwise. At least not in the beginning. And I, at least once the guidelines were no longer mandatory, it really changed things. But with the 3 strikes laws and how they had a disproportionate impact on minorities, it still left you in a position where you were sending people to jail for essentially the rest of their lives. And all I can tell you is that, as a matter of fact, from what I saw, many more young Black men ended up in jail for essentially crimes that were not something that you would think were worth life in prison. I know that judges have now undergone a lot of training with respect to implicit bias. I think that was something that was not really understood until more recent years, but in the last 10 years or so, there is a lot of implicit bias training. And I know that it's happening in the law enforcement world as well. So I know there are efforts being made, and it's just a question of how quickly we can make change given how bad things have gotten.
Okay, all right. Well, there's a question from the audience that is directly, I think, on some of the points that you've been making, and it has to do with the doctrine of qualified immunity, right? The idea that that government officials aren't necessarily or not personally liable for their acts as government officials. And is this something that we should look at? Does it contribute to the idea that police can operate with impunity? Are there ways in which we can adjust our understanding of the law that enable us to, I guess, incentivize better policing? And
can I start on that one? Because I had to rule on a lot of those cases. I think that remember, it's not absolute. It's not supposed to be absolute immunity. It's supposed to be qualified immunity. And I think qualified immunity and this is primarily relating to police officers, has its role, an important role. Police officers have to make decisions in split-second circumstances. They have to decide whether engaging in some level of force is necessary to either protect their own lives, or more importantly, I usually see it where they feel it's necessary to protect the life of a third party. Having said that, I think that the law got too far out of whack. It got to the point where it was almost absolute immunity. I can tell you that almost every time I denied qualified immunity to a police officer, I was reversed. And I wasn't often reversed by the Sixth Circuit, I'm happy to say, but there were a couple very, very troubling instances in which I was reversed under 1983. And I think that what happens is, as a result, there are bad police officers who then make everything difficult for the rest of the law enforcement officers who really do want to do their job and do want to do it properly and who deserve some level of immunity. So the answer is, do I think it needs to be recalibrated? I've thought that all the way back since about 1995. Do I think it should be done away with? No, I don't.
Okay. Brian, Sean?
My views very much mirror that of Judge O'Malley's. I believe that qualified immunity is important because of the same things that the judge just articulated. Police officers are put in positions every day where they have to make split-second decisions, which are in fact life and death. And my worry, as I think Matt kind of referred to in terms of talking about young cadets who would be immediately let go under a defund the police program, which I also oppose. I worry if we were to do away with qualified immunity, we wouldn't be able to recruit good people to become police officers. And that doesn't help us. That doesn't help our quest for justice. That doesn't help our desire to implement meaningful criminal justice reform if we can't actually recruit good people into these positions. But I also agree with the judge that there are certainly circumstances where the qualified immunity wasn't qualified, and it's given cover to police officers who didn't deserve it.
Okay. Sean and then Matthew.
You know, I think the judge and Brian hit it right on. I don't have a ton to add. I would just clarify that. So I'm in the public corruption section, so I am on the criminal side, and I prosecute police officers. So qualified immunity is in the civil law. It has to do with private damages, whether a private citizen can sue a police officer and get damages. They have to overcome the qualified immunity hurdle. In the criminal context, we don't have to deal with that. We're under just a straight Fourth Amendment reasonableness standard. So that's a sort of just a general point. But I agree with the judge. And Brian, it has its place, but it's been taken too far.
And just let me follow up. And the reasonableness standard, do you think that is, as it's currently interpreted, is adequate for you to do your job?
I do. And, you know, again, reasonableness is pretty vague, and it creates room for prosecutorial discretion. But I think, you know, there just has to be discretion and interpretation at times, because there are too many factual scenarios to write a law for every single one. So we have to have sort of an umbrella concept and see how these different factual scenarios fall in. But, you know, so when I'm exercising prosecutorial discretion, you know, what would be guiding me is pretty similar to what should be the qualified immunity analysis. Was this a split-second decision that someone just did the wrong thing? They made an honest mistake, and maybe there were tragic consequences, and God, we wish we could turn back time, but did they have criminal intent? Or has this someone, you know, really knowingly done something wrong? So for example, I recently prosecuted and convicted two Chicago police officers who were knowingly going out and getting fake search warrants. They were paying people on the street to lie to judges to get fake search warrants, to say they had been in homes that they had not been in, to say they'd seen things that they had not seen. And then with those warrants, they would go in and rob the places, but under the color of law, with this protection that they had a warrant. So that was, you know, that was clearly outside of the bounds under any legal formula. So maybe it's more of a technical point, but I think that the judge and Brian laid out the balance really well.
Okay. Matt, anything to add?
I guess the only thing I would add is that you raised an interesting point. There are three very educated people on this panel, and all of them, and myself included, tend to agree that there is a normative value that is promoted by a qualified immunity, and yet it has gone too far. And, you know, like make it less abstract, what I would say is in Washington State, in order to prosecute an officer for use of deadly force, you have to prove actual malice. And so that's where it gets a little squishier. I know Sean had mentioned, you know, showing that maybe they knowingly wanted to commit a crime, or, you know, it's criminal intent. It's very difficult to glean malice from an act. And so one can imagine a number of scenarios which the community at large would like to see a person prosecuted, and yet as a result of this law, it basically ties the the prosecutor's hands as it relates to their ability to do anything. And then the question becomes, well, if the majority of the people in the community want there to be a law that allows for this, then why isn't there one? And why is it that, I remember speaking to Senator Frocht, he's our state senator, and he said, because the police lobby is very powerful. It's bigger than the PD lobby. And so that invites other questions, but it stands to reason that if all of us are having this conversation about why qualified immunity has almost become absolute immunity, how is it possible we can't find a middle ground? And I think that's probably beyond the scope of the question, but that's just the only thing I wanted to add to that.
The Supreme Court did turn down several cases this past week where they could have addressed the question. I think they're just not ready to yet.
So, is there a way, so there are a number of questions that have come up on the feed. So, because we've identified, right now, and I think if we dug deeper, we could identify more. But right now we have sort of two problems on the table, right? One is policing, and the way in which policing, suffers from a number of problems. Racial bias is one, and that is often, how is it that we maintain adequate control over the people who actually exercise, deadly violence as they go about and enforce the law. The second one is the politicization of the judiciary and why that is corrosive to the whole notion of the rule of law. And so one of the things that some of our listeners or viewers are concerned about is, what are some of the pathways out? What do you see as sort of necessary or important to start happening so that we can begin to, on the one hand, address some of these problems, but also, I think, more broadly, because both sets of issues that you guys have identified, really say in some ways, look, the system is really being overstressed right now. We're putting too much pressure on sort of the criminal justice and legal systems in the United States. And we need to see more action from the other branches of government to address some of these issues. And so, given where you sit, what are some of the things that, or just as simply as citizens, what are some of the things that you would like to see happen that could help us productively address these problems, inside American politics? Anyone like to go first? All right, well, I'll start with Mr. Franzblau. Sean.
So it's a great question, maybe the most important question. So I think it goes back to norms, because I think that the erosion that we've witnessed recently is really primarily normative based. And we need to kind of recarve out those areas of public life that are just purely American issues, not Republican issues, not Democratic issues, but just these are American issues. And these are things that we embrace and are part of our ethos as American citizens. So things like voting and making, voting easier, that really shouldn't be a controversial thing. Judicial confirmations, I think one of the sides is going to have to put their weapon down first and make a first step at conciliation, because as the other panelists have pointed out, neither side has clean hands here. It's a timely question. Obviously, we're in the middle of a Supreme Court confirmation hearing, and I've been thinking about what I would do if I were a senator right now. And I am upset about what happened with Merrick Garland, for obvious reasons. But if we continue this tit for tat, it's just going to continue to spiral. So I think the voters, if the voters want to hold Mitch McConnell and other folks accountable for what went on with Merrick Garland, they should do that. And that's the appropriate avenue to do that. But when it comes to a senator's position, I think we need to get back to the senator's advice and consent role. Is really a question is this person qualified? Does this person clearly come in with where they're going to be outcome driven and seeking to overturn laws without really carefully looking at the facts first? That is how it used to be. There was a time before that when it was politicized too, but I think we need to get back to those basic norms we had, where certain things are outside of the political arena, that we're just going to for the sake of our democracy, we're going to set those aside. And that might involve sacrifice. That might involve the sting of feeling like, yes, the Supreme Court was stolen. But someone's got to take the first move. So those are some scattered thoughts.
Well, I mean, it's a hard question. And so, your scattered thoughts are fine in this because, the way I tell my students is I often present them with very hard problems and they get all flustered. And I said, look, if the problems were easy to solve, they wouldn't be problems. We would have solved them by now. And so that's one of the reasons why we're in this is these are deep problems. They're difficult. But sort of trying just to brainstorm and think through, okay, what is it that we can do to sort of move, in the direction of creating a sort of, turning down the temperature, creating a system where we can speak with one another, I think is really important. Matt, do you have questions? And then I'll go to Brian.
I guess the only thing I was going to add is, obviously, Sean, I agree with you, and I wish we can kind of just all like when they go low, we go high sort of thing, right? And it just kind of feels like you're kind of constantly in this situation where Democrats are always having to take the high ground, and it's like these are really important, consequential decisions. And you mentioned voting, right? Like this is something that we should all agree on, and yet that's a highly partisan issue. We know that there are large segments of the country who do not want to make it easy to vote. And the question is like, why? And that kind of brings me to my main concern, which is just frankly I don't know how you would call it, just the proliferation of disinformation on social media, because it allows people to retreat into their camps and what they believe. And it basically does away with truth. Truth becomes what you want it to believe, and then you're able to just access information that feeds into that idea. And so it makes it hard for there to be agreement on these things, right? Like that letter has been, circulating a lot, which is George Bush's letter to Bill Clinton, and like that day, that time in America seems so far in the past now. And it's why. And it's when you look at this, when you go onto the Facebook or social media, all you keep getting inundated with is all of this stuff that could be true, but the truth of it is secondary. And figuring out a way to recapture value in the truth seems to be like the first thing we need to do in order to get this conversation going in the right direction.
Brian, you had your hand up.
Yeah, first of all, I think Matthew is absolutely right. One of my greatest frustrations and fears from the last 4 years is the attack on objective truth. From things as minimal as my crowd was bigger than your crowd at an inauguration to much larger issues. And that I truly believe has truth shouldn't be a partisan issue. Both sides of a political aisle should be able to agree on truth. In terms of the question about what do we do about it, I guess I have a couple ideas since you asked. And one of the first things that I would identify as a problem in our body politic right now is the insistence on ideological purity and the somehow decision that compromise is evil. And, the Constitution was a compromise. And compromises, and there were compromises in there that were racist, allowing slavery, of course. But there were also compromises that allowed for the bicameral legislature and separation of powers. And so compromise is not a bad thing. When I worked in DC in the White House, and then later up on Capitol Hill, I always marveled at how often the Republican Party back then tried to demonize Ted Kennedy, but then struck deals with the guy. Ted Kennedy was this liberal lion from Massachusetts who actually was a great compromiser. He wrote the No Child Left Behind bill with George W. Bush. And that sense of compromise is important in a democracy. It's important for us to actually be able to work together. And I think the insistence on ideological purity has hurt both parties. It's hurt both parties. And I will speak about my own. In 2016, I was a supporter of Hillary Clinton. And There were a lot of people on the left who did not support her. And many of them, although Bernie Sanders eventually endorsed her, some might say half-heartedly, many of the people on the left just couldn't bring themselves to come together behind her candidacy because she wasn't ideologically pure enough. And now look at where the Supreme Court has gone because of that. So that's hurt. I think it certainly hurt us on the left and in the Democratic Party. I think it's hurt people on the right as well. The fact that Republican legislators are seen as traitors if they so much as have lunch with somebody on the Democratic side hurts our ability to pass decent legislation. Hurts our ability to have good conversation about what is in the best interest of the country. And so I guess one way I think to go forward is to have leaders in both parties say, I stand up for my principles and I stand up for my values, but I'm willing to engage with the other side and I'm willing to talk about compromise. I really think that that's one area where we could really improve. The two other things on my list here. The next one is gerrymandering. I really think gerrymandering has hurt our ability to have people reach across the aisle because so much of our House seats in particular are gerrymandered that there isn't a necessity to compromise. This necessity, in fact, is to reach for ideological purity, because if you don't, you'll be challenged from your right if you're a Republican, or you'll be challenged from your left if you're a Democrat. And there is no advantage to reaching across the aisle. And because of gerrymandering, it's almost a political necessity not to. So I would like to see a fair drawing of districts, which would create a political need to compromise. And then the last thing really only applies on the local level, but I'll still say it. In Colorado, we have term limits for our state legislature. And a state legislator can't serve more than 8 years. And I think that's hurt us. And I think that's hurt other legislatures in other states. And this is why. The statistics showed, and I wrote a paper on it in law school, that most legislators didn't actually stay for decades and decades. They served their time for a certain number of years and then moved on to other things. But there were a couple who did. And that institutional memory of having some people who had seen what we did the last time we had a recession and seen what we did when we had this crisis, and also understood that reaching across the aisle was important to create good policy. They're all wiped out now. And in a state legislature where you have term limits, there is no incentive to work across the aisle because you're not going to be there a couple years later, and neither is the other guy. And I think that's hurt us as well.
Okay. Judge O'Malley?
Yeah, I agree with everything that everyone has said. In fact, on the compromise point, I think back to 1994 when I was able to get on the bench. Howard Metzenbaum was about to retire, and he didn't want to retire with an open seat in the Northern District of Ohio since he was from Cleveland. And so he went to Orrin Hatch to get an extra hearing for the Judiciary Committee put in place right before Congress went out of session. And Orrin Hatch agreed to do it, agreed to show up so there would be a quorum. And I wouldn't be here without the fact that Orrin Hatch was willing to do his friend, Howard Metzenbaum, a favor. I don't think that would happen today, sadly. But on the bigger issue, I think that one thing that seems to be lost is, I worked for a public official when I worked for Lee Fisher, who was Attorney General for the state of Ohio. And he always took the view that being elected was a privilege, but that he was elected to serve. And so it was more of an obligation than a privilege. And I think that at least with respect to the executive branch, we've started to lose that. And we've started to lose the understanding that you have an obligation to behave in certain ways to make sure that the institutions of government are protected. And then that goes to the legislature. The legislature has an obligation to not just do whatever the president wants or attack whatever the president wants. They have an obligation to be thoughtful and to do their jobs and to understand that they have an obligation. They just don't have a right to be there. They have an obligation that comes along with being there. And I think that if our elected officials don't keep that in mind, then I think the voters should tell them we're not going to stand for it. And to me, I think that's one of the most important things to keep in mind.
All right. Well, that leads us to I think one other question that has come out of the audience, and that is checks and balances, right? It seems in some way, for some of the reasons that you guys alluded to, is in some sense broken, because ultimately the rule of law at the macro level, requires that the different elements of the state check one another, right? That no one can manipulate the state so that they are outside of any institutional check on their authority or what they might do. And yet it seems like that right now between the Senate and the president, you have a situation where substantial checks have gone by the wayside. And you can see that, say, with impeachment, but there are also other instances, right? That and so the question from the audience is inside American politics, what can we do to try and reestablish these checks? What's necessary to begin to move the American political system so that we do have checks and balances again that are meaningful on the different branches of government?
Well, I can start at least as it relates to the courts, because I do think that at the end of the day, the court's right of judicial review and the public's respect for that right of judicial review is probably the most important check that we have. I mean, I think the separation of powers, there are three separate branches, and that all of them need to act as a check on each other. I mean, the legislature should pass laws regardless of whether the president says he wants those laws. And they shouldn't just pass them because the president told them to. But beyond that, I think that the other piece of the protection of the rule of law is that we have to make sure that we don't so degrade the courts and so politicize the courts that the public loses trust in the court's decisions. And I think that is, to me, that's why I come back to the social contract. The social contract will fall apart if we don't trust the institutions of government. It's that whole important concept. So I think that we have to stop this politicization of the courts, this attack on the judiciary, and we have got to make sure that the public appreciates that the courts are there for them, not for the president, not for the legislature, and that the government is as answerable to the courts as is any individual.
Okay. Matthew, you have anything to add?
No, I'll just keep this short, just out of respect for time. We got to vote. I mean, the bottom line is decisions are made by, African-American men, they don't vote as much as they should. Hispanic men don't vote as much as they should. People need to vote and participate in this experiment that we have, because that's the only way we're going to get policies that we want. It kind of goes back to what Tocqueville said about like the mediocratizing effect of large-scale democracies. Like the bigger and bigger you get, the harder it is to have nuance. And then you compound that with the two-party system, and then you're just appealing to the largest group. And in order to ameliorate that effect, you need to have other people voting and having skin in the game. And so if I could say one thing, it would just be to vote. Mail-in voting, in-person voting, I don't care, just vote.
Just vote. All right. Brian?
I guess I would repeat to my theme from my previous answer, and that is adherence to ideological purity as opposed to loyalty to an institution and even the greater good of the country. When Bill Clinton was in office, there were Democrats in the U.S. Senate and the U.S. House who opposed him. And that wasn't seen as absolute betrayal that was seen as standing up for the rights of the legislative branch. When George W. Bush nominated Harriet Miers for Supreme Court seat, the Republicans in the Senate essentially forced him to change his mind. And I think having people who protect the separation of powers is important. And I believe in the strong executive. I've worked in the executive branch, but I also believe in the legislative branch and in the judicial branch. And we have to have people who serve in those branches who are loyal to them and defend them. And that's honestly one of my other critiques of the modern era. And I think it has harmed our democracy, the extent to which elected officials in the Republican Party have supported Donald Trump in things that really go against their own principles and values, out of loyalty to a man instead of out of loyalty to an institution or to the country.
Okay, Sean?
So, the design of the checks and balance system was, this idea of ambition counteracting ambition. There was this thought that the institutions would be jealous of one another. There wasn't sort of this planning and, accordingly structuring the government in such a way where they foresaw party loyalty, but that things were lining up along different lines, not institution against institution, but party against party. So there's this real problem with this dominant line that's been drawn that I think the founders were not thinking of when they designed the institutions. But I know I was critical of the judiciary in a way before, but what I really want to say is I think the federal judiciary is keeping our democracy afloat right now. I think they've actually functioned extraordinarily well. I think we are in an aberrational time. I think some of our institutions have been bent. They are not broken. Hopefully we will be transitioning into a new time soon. And when we do, we will have federal judges, people like Matthew and Brian, who are dedicated public servants, who are continuing to keep the faith, who are continuing to practice these norms that are so ingrained in us as Americans, even though we have sort of aberrational leadership right now. Those folks do not reflect who we are. They have not infected, they've not gotten to the root of our institutions, and they will hopefully soon be rid of them.
Okay, well, that was very, very hopeful. But now the question has just emerged, which puts a less hopeful spin on things, which is, and this is from a student, which is, if the social contract is no longer working, or people feel like the social contract is no longer working, is it possible for them to exit? Do they have a right of exit? If they look and say, hey, the system's not working, this is not the social contract, I understand. Right? Should, will they leave?
God, I hope not. That's all I can say. I think sadly, there are many options for people. One of them is not to participate in the social contract anymore, but that is the worst thing that could happen to us.
All right. Well, and it also brings up the point, right? And we've seen what is it? Sort of armed militias have played a role in American, or now playing a role in American politics, which at least for my experience seems quite unusual, right? Is this a symptom of the idea that the social contract, that there are people out there now looking and saying, hey, the system, it's just not working, that I'm getting ready to either leave it or redefine it on the terms that I think it should reflect? I mean, is that why we're seeing this? There was, as you know, a couple of days ago, a plot that was wound up by the FBI for kidnapping the governor of Michigan. And so are we actually seeing, you think, some of that the delegitimization has gone to such a degree that there are people now who are seriously considering whether or not the system really works or is worth saving?
I don't know.
Go ahead. I was just going to say, and maybe this is a good segue to you, Matthew, is that I'm not sure if it's a symptom or a cause. In other words, it's the part of the problem is that we're not allowing the rule of law to control those kind of behaviors. Luckily, that plot was foiled, but there is not enough that's going on to quell those things.
Okay. All right. Matt?
I guess it just kind of depends on how far you want to step back in terms of how far you want to broaden the scope of history, right? I feel like right now it looks like very dangerous times. And if I were, a teenager or something, I would see what's going on right now and think that what we're living in is unparalleled chaos and be very scared. But, I think it was Brian who mentioned, the Trail of Tears. I mean, that was an act of Andrew Jackson, literally just ignoring the Supreme Court and doing something that was declared to be unconstitutional. We're talking about packing the courts. I think about FDR and him threatening to pack the courts if they didn't do the things that he wanted to do. And I think about all these examples in history, and I'm hoping that this saga, this ordeal that we've been dealing with for the last 8 years, like we're going to see, the endurance and how robust and how durable our institutions are in our experiment, right? Because if we're able to come out of this 8 years and sort of with fresh eyes and new insights, then if anything, it could be proof of how strong our democracy really is. I think right now is kind of that's a pivot point. I guess it remains to be seen what will actually happen.
Okay. Brian?
I don't have a whole lot to add to this one. I do think that the emergence of militias is a threat to the rule of law. And I think government institutions have to say very strongly, starting at the top, including from the president, that there's only one institution that enforces the law, and that's the United States government. And if we don't say that strongly, and if we have dog whistles that give credence to militias or credence to racist groups on the right, or militias or groups on the left, that undermines the rule of law and undermines democracy. And we all really need to speak with one voice on that issue.
Yes, I think a few things are going on in the country right now. There are demographic shifts that are going on that I think are making some white people feel that they're losing power, losing their status in this country, and they're reacting violently to that. I think, there have always been nut jobs out there like the Michigan militia. Now they're able to connect with their nut job friends over Facebook and create a network and encourage each other. And then you have an erosion in norms where we don't have clear leadership doing basic things like condemning white supremacy. So there's sort of this, again, it's a terrible confluence, but I do think we're gonna have demographic shifts in the internet going forward. But I think that there's this problem from the top that is uniquely exacerbating the situation. I also think frankly, I'm from Michigan. It's this great source of embarrassment, the Michigan militia, but I think they're responding to the fact that it's a female governor and they didn't like being told what to do by a woman, frankly, a strong, really smart woman who's performed extraordinarily well during the COVID crisis. I think that made these men feel particularly insecure. So, we have to be vigilant against white supremacism, and we need to condemn it and call it out when we see it, and vigorously prosecute it.
Okay. All right. Well, one final question. And are you hopeful? Hopeful in the resilience of American democracy? Hopeful in the resilience of the American experiment? I know, Matthew, I like you say we're at a pivot point. And one of the terrible things about pivot points is you don't know which way the future lies, right? But, are you hopeful? I mean, it does, from where you sit, which is, inside, the core institution that generates liberal regimes. Are you hopeful for the future? And I'll let anybody start who would like. All right, I'll call on somebody.
I never want to go before the judge. That's just indoctrinated. So drilled into me to never interrupt it, cut off the judge.
All right. Well, let me just, I guess my short answer is yes. Yes. For the reasons that Matthew said, this is not the first time the country's been in crisis. Because we're here, it feels worse, but I'm sure that those on the Supreme Court felt like they were being very much attacked when FDR was going through his court packing plan, and it almost succeeded. So I am hopeful, and I think that I think society is going to step up and things are going to change. And I don't just, I'm not being political here. I'm not saying we're going to get a new president or not get a new president. I think whatever happens, there's going to be some pressure for change.
Sean?
I think that's right. I think we have a real problem in this country where our representative institutions are broken down. The outcomes or lack thereof in Congress are not reflecting the will of the American people. So the good news is that, I still have great faith in the American people, and that, the vast majority of us hold our core values still and hold them strongly. There are some institutional breakdowns, a lot that Brian touched on, in the ways that our electoral maps are drawn, the way our primary system works, and some of the incentives that happens when you get into Congress, such that the will of the people is not being translated. So I do have faith, but we have some serious work to do on the structure of our government and getting back to the rule of law. Remember, the founders also built into that short, vague, but beautiful, I want to be clear about that document, the ability to revisit it and fix it and revise it, and so you can continue to grow with it. And we've sort of forgotten that mechanism, and we need to revisit our constitutional blueprint and get a government that reflects our values and make sure that our institutions are routinely reflecting the will of the American people.
Okay, Brian?
Yes, I'm hopeful, but it's a qualified hope. It's a qualified hope because of what we've experienced the last few years. And I think it's still to be seen the degree to which we are able to repair the fissures in our democracy, and the fact that we really do have serious disagreements over objective truth, and that one side of our country can hear their news from a certain source and another can hear it from another, and literally disagree on things when there is a truthful answer and an untruthful answer, really worries me. And yet, I will say, from a very personal standpoint, one of the silver linings to running a campaign during this pandemic is that I've been able to have people work on the campaign outside of Colorado who never would have. And that includes 7 Kenyon students. I've had 7 interns work on this campaign who are Kenyon College students. And interacting with them and talking with them about not just the nuts and bolts of the campaign, but the big issues of our day, I brought out my old Quest for Justice book. I still have it from my freshman year as a poli-sci major at Kenyon. And interacting with the young students who are now powering Kenyon College really does give me hope. I mean, it really does, because they are so masterful in being able to talk about these big issues and passionate about wanting to make our world a better place. And so that gives me more hope than anything else for the future.
Okay, and Matthew, I'll give you the last word, but I also have a specific question before you get to hope that has to do with the LEAD program in Seattle.
Oh yeah, by Lisa Dugard. She got the MacArthur Fellow for the LEAD program. That's I don't know a whole bunch about the LEAD program, but I know that is a big deal. And I used to work with Lisa Dugard. I'm really proud of her for being recognized nationally for that.
Okay, well, the question is would you amend or expand it? And I guess that
I mean, I would definitely expand it to the extent that resources are available. I work in juvie court, and so to the extent that there's any diversionary program that allows for somebody not to just get hit with the hammer, I'm all for that, just because I think it generally is better for everyone. The person comes back into the community with some structure. I guess really quickly, just to answer your question, I don't think this is going to surprise anyone, but I really was taken by what Brian said, because I think over the course of the next 50 years, I feel pretty good about our outcomes, just because I talk to young people every day and I know where they stand on issues like climate change and LGBTQ rights and racial equality. I get really concerned about these next 20, 30 years. And when it comes to that, it's, you know, we've been talking about justices a lot, and it's going to come down to one Chief Justice and 8 justices, I think. You know, when it comes down to how they're going to decide if there's not a revolution of 1800 where the president actually begrudgingly, peacefully passes over the power, you know. And I hope that, you know, we get these justices and we like to think we know what they're going to do. And certainly we have some good idea, but, you know, when Reagan appointed Kennedy, he thought he was getting somebody different. And when Sandra Day O'Connor came in, she kind of moderated on social issues. People change as a result of seeing America from a different perspective when you're in that ivory tower. And so I'm kind of hoping that even though things look kind of grim right now, that you know, we can be pleasantly surprised with what we get.
All right. Well, I would like to you know, thank you all for a wonderful and very interesting conversation this evening. You know, and I'll just summarize some of the points that I got from it. One is that you know, one of the things I heard coming out of the conversation is that the rule of law is under stress, and that some of the stresses that we face are actually coming from the failure of other parts or the dysfunction in other parts of the government. And I think Congress bears a large role here, right? That the failure of deliberation and legislation moving out of the Congress has really put a lot of pressure on the courts as sort of the locus of where we resolve pressing social conflicts, when it really should be in the Congress amongst our representatives. And so that's, I think, something important. Another thing that I heard, which I found really interesting, was how much stress that all of you put on the normative structure beneath the law, right? That at the end of the day, law is the written law is words on a page, and those words alone are not sufficient. And so we have to pay attention to the normative understandings that are underneath that, and how those normative understandings can either conduce or not conduce toward having a rule of law governed society. And that we should pay attention to those normative underpinnings, which then leads to a third implication, which is that leadership matters. And I'm going to, I don't know if you caught our first panel, but there was a very interesting exchange in the first panel where one of the panelists, Sarah Longwell, basically said, you know, leadership character matters. It's not just about policy, it's about, you know, the values that people bring to bear as they decide. And it goes back, I think, to the idea of that we bear obligations to our citizens when we assume positions of public authority, well, to fellow citizens when we assume positions of public authority. And so if you want those norms supported, then that means that you have to have the right people in place, all the way from, you know, which cadets do we, you know, get into the police academy and then use them to police, you know, to police our neighborhoods, up to, you know, who do we elect in the House, who do we elect in the Senate, who do we elect for the president. If we have that, character matters in all of these ways, because norms are so fundamentally important to the world that we want to create and that we want to live in. And so those are sort of my takeaways, and I think they're very important. I'm also, my final takeaway is I'm very touched about the optimism that you all bear for the future, right? This has been the past years have been a sore test in many ways for American democracy, and not just going to 2016. I think we can go back even further. And yet to say that, you know, the system, the institutions, the structures, and most importantly, the people are resilient, I think is a very hopeful message, and one that I would like to end this evening's discussion on, if that's okay with you. All right. Well, thank you so much, Judge O'Malley, Matthew, Brian, Sean. It's been a delight for me tonight to listen to you speak. I have learned a lot. There are a lot of things now I'm going to think about in a slightly different way because of our conversation. I wish you well, and I thank you from the bottom of my heart for agreeing to take the time to talk with us this evening. With that, I would, one more thing, and then I'm going to call everything to a close. This is the third of 6 panels that the Center for the Study of American Democracy is doing to explore our current political moment. We convene again next Tuesday night, October 20th at 7 p.m., where we will be discussing the role of America in the world. And think about the ways both in which the United States and the decisions that we're making this fall may well affect the role of the United States in the world, but also the way in which the world is affecting the nature and operations of American democracy. It promises to be a very sort of exciting and interesting conversation. And so I encourage everyone to come listen in. With that, again, thank you all. Thank you, the viewers, for taking the time. I'm sorry that we were not able to get to every question. I know there were a couple that came in right at the end that I really wanted to address, but I've already taken up far too much time of our guests. So with that, I call the evening to a close. Thank you.
Good luck, Brian, in the election.
Hey, yeah.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you so much.
Guys,
Thank you.
thank you so much. And it was wonderful. And yeah, that's all I can say.